Good morning to all of you. What a blessing to see everyone. It's a nice morning to gather and worship the Lord, and seems apparent that some are sick, and then some, I don't know, are maybe not here for other reasons that I don't know of, but either way, I just wanted to remind us to go towards the Gideon story this morning. I like to pick out characters of the Old Testament and find lots of interesting things about them. And it's a little bit of a story, a little bit long story. I'll read Judges chapter 6, 7. Some of it in 8 I'll skip just for it seems hardly compatible with the scenes that they made in their war. Anyhow, I'm just going to read Judges chapter 6 and 7, and then have a few thoughts I want to share. Okay, so Gideon, well, maybe it's good to know, Gideon was one of the judges. You all know that, but he seems to be a standout here in what I see in the judges, just in how many things he did that was good for the Lord, good for the people there, and he all but one time he called out to the Lord for help and for direction, and about all the things he did, he really, especially when it came to going out, defeating the enemies and subduing the nations around them that were wicked, he would call on the Lord, and he wouldn't just quickly make a decision to do things. Other than, towards the end of his life, he asked his people to bring together all the plunder, and a lot of it had to do with gold and fancy clothes from the Midianites and their allies. And he took it and he made a beautiful ephod out of it. And the people, Gideon's people, the children of Israel, ended up making worship to this ephod that he put there in Ophrah, was Gideon's town, Ophrah. And it just kind of, I noticed that he had not asked the Lord before he asked the people to bring forth the plunder, and before he formed this beautiful ephod. Anyhow, that's just very common for Old Testament figures. They still have their weaknesses. So let's just remember that as we go through here. But ultimately, I think Gideon was a mighty man of faith in the Lord Jesus, and that is very clear here. Judges chapter 6. The Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites were so cruel that the Israelites made hiding places for themselves in the mountains and caves. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midians, Amalekites, and the people of the east would attack Israel, camping in the land and destroying crops as far away as Gaza. They left the Israelites with nothing to eat, taking all the sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. These enemy hordes, coming with their livestock and tents, were as thick as the locusts. They arrived on droves of camels, too numerous to count, and they stayed until the land was stripped bare. So Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. And this, I'll stop a little bit. This is, again, just a part of that vicious cycle that always happened for Israel whenever they did not obey the Lord. When they would do evil on the side of the Lord, there was these kind of punishments that would come their ways. and it reduced them to starvation. Then they cried out to the Lord. When they cried out to the Lord because of the Midians, the Lord sent a prophet to the Israelites. He said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Say, I brought you up out of slavery in Egypt. I rescued you from the Egyptians and from all who oppressed you. I drove out your enemies and gave you their land. I told you, I am the Lord your God. You must not worship the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you now live, but you must listen to me." Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash, the clan of Abiezer. Joash was Gideon's dad. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." "Sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you. "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least of my entire family." The Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." Gideon replied, "If you are truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it is really the Lord speaking to me. Don't go away until I come back and bring my offering to you." He said, I will stay here until you return." Gideon hurried home. He cooked a young goat, and with a basket of flour he baked some bread without yeast. Then, carrying the meat in a basket and the broth in a pot, he brought them out and presented them to the angel who was under the great oak. The angel of the Lord said to him, "Place the meat and the unleavened bread on this rock and pour the broth over it." Gideon did as he was told. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the bread with the tip of the staff, and fire flamed up from the rock and consumed all he had brought. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he cried out, "O sovereign Lord, I'm doomed. I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." "It is all right," the Lord replied. "Don't be afraid. You will not die." And Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and named it Yahweh Shalom, which means the Lord is peace. The altar remains in Ophrah in the land of the clan of Abiezer to this day. That night the Lord said to Gideon, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the one that is 7 years old. Pull down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole standing beside it. Then build an altar to the Lord your God here on this hilltop sanctuary, laying the stones carefully. Sacrifice the bull as a burnt offering on the altar, using as fuel the wood of the Asherah pole you cut down." So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord had commanded. He did it at night because he was afraid of the other members of his father's household and the people of the town. Early the next morning, as the people of the town began to stir, someone discovered that the altar of Baal had been broken down and that the Asherah pole beside it had been cut down. In their place, a new altar had been built, and on it were the remains of the bull that had been sacrificed. The people said to each other, "Who did this?" And after asking around and making a careful search, they learned that it was Gideon, the son of Joash. "Bring out your son," the men of the town demanded of Joash. "He must die for destroying the altar of Baal and for cutting down the Asherah pole." But Joash shouted to the mob that confronted him, "Why are you defending Baal? Will you argue his case? Whoever pleads his case will be put to death by morning. If Baal truly is a god, let him defend himself and destroy the one who broke down his altar." From then on, Gideon was called Jerubbaal, which means "let Baal defend himself," because he broke down Baal's altar. I find it interesting that as far as Gideon having victory, it seemed the success of his victory depended on doing his homework, getting things right in his own place, in his own tribe or country or family. And I just can't imagine them having any kind of victory had those had that Baal altar and the Asherah pole not been taken care of first. I mean, the Lord just shows himself to have that kind of heart, how that there needs to be the homework comes first, right? Like that needs to be taken care of first. Soon afterward, the armies of Midian, Amalek, and the rest of the people formed an allegiance against Israel and crossed the Jordan, camping in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. He blew a ram's horn as a call to arms, and the men of the clan of Abiezer came to him. He also sent messengers shouting throughout, saying, "Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali," summoning their weapons, and all of them responded. Then Gideon said to God, "If you are truly going to use me to rescue Israel, as you promised, prove it to me in this way. I will put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you are going to help me rescue Israel as you promised." And that is just what happened. When Gideon got up early the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out a whole bowl full of water. Remember, the ground was dry and the fleece was wet. Then Gideon said to God, "Please don't be angry with me. Let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece for one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew." So that night, God did as Gideon asked. The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew. So Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and his army got up early and went away as far as the spring of Herat. The armies of Midian were camped north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength." That stood out to me. "Therefore, tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home." So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. But the Lord told Gideon, "There are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not." When Gideon took his warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, "Divide the men into two groups. The one group put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it up with their tongues like a dog. In the other group put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouth in the stream." Only 300 of the men drank from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouth in the stream. The Lord told Gideon, "With these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home." So Gideon collected the provisions and ram's horns and the other warriors and sent them home, but he kept the 300 with them. The Midianite camp was in the valley just below Gideon. That night the Lord said, "Get up, go down into the Midian camp, for I will give you victory over them. But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you will be greatly encouraged. Then you will be eager to attack." So Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. The enemies of Midian, Amalek, and the rest of the people of the east had settled in the valley like a swarm of locusts. Their camels were like grains of sand on the seashore, too many to count. Gideon crept up just as a man was telling his companion about a dream. This man said, "I had this dream, and in my dream a loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp. It hit a tent, turned it over, and knocked it flat." His companion answered, "Your dream can mean only one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash, the victory over Midian and all its allies." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship before the Lord. That stood out to me. It also stands out just how not only was Gideon asking favors of the Lord for proof or for confidence, the Lord also reached out to Gideon just with things of proof to give him courage. And I think that's something to remember, that the Lord does those things. He will, we're in a true and right relationship with Him. He will notice us, and He will favor us in our desire to know truth. Maybe we won't really be able to hear the enemy whisper or talk about their dream and the interpretation, but it's still, the point's still there for us here in the New Testament times. How the Lord has ways of giving great courage to His people. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship before the Lord. Then he turned to the Israelite camp and shouted, "Get up! The Lord has given you victory over the Midianite hordes." He divided the 300 men into 3 groups and gave each man a ram's horn and a clay jar and a torch in it. Then he said to them, "Keep your eyes on me. When I come to the edge of the camp, do just as I do. As soon as I and those with me blow the ram's horn, blow your horns too, all around the entire camp, and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." It was just after midnight, after the change of the guard, when Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the Midianite camp. Suddenly they blew the ram's horns and broke their clay jars. Then all 3 groups blew their horns and broke their jars. They held the blazing torch in their left hand. Held the blazing torch in their left hand and the horns in their right hand, and they all shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Now just picture that this would have been the noise of them being surrounded for the Midianites and the Amalekites. But they weren't really surrounded by the hordes of the Israelites, or the big groups of Israelites. It was, even though it was just 300 men, that probably came to their ears like, "Hey, we're surrounded, and we're caught." And then in the midst of that, the Lord sent confusion yet. I'll just read it. Each man stood at his position around the camp and watched as all the Midianites rushed around in a panic, shouting as they ran to escape. When the 300 Israelites blew their ram's horns, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their swords. Those who were not killed fled to places as far away as Zerah, and to the border of Abel Meholah near Tabbath. Then Gideon sent for the warriors of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh, who joined in chasing the army of Midian. Gideon also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down to attack the Midianites. Cut them off at the shallow crossings of the Jordan River at Beth-barah." So all the men of Ephraim did as they were told. Orab and Zeb, the two Midianite commanders, killing Orab at the rock of Orab, and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. And they continued to chase the Midianites. Afterward, the Israelites brought the head of Orab and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan River. Then the people of Ephraim asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us this way?" Maybe it's important just for the sake of... So the Ephraimites, they were a part of Gideon's army too. The army that was brought in as a second wind to help chase the Midianites. There were only 300 men in the original outbreak, but then Gideon called on others as well, and they responded. And Ephraim and his men, the men of Ephraim, were a part of that. Okay, so now the conversation comes between Ephraim, his men, and Gideon. And they say, "Why have you treated us this way? Why didn't you send us when you first went out to fight the Midianites?" And they argued heatedly with Gideon. Now listen to Gideon's reply. Gideon replied, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't even the leftover grapes of Ephraim's harvest better than the entire crop of my little clan of Ebezer? God gave you victory over Orab and Zeb, the commanders of the Midianites' army. What have I accomplished compared to that?" When the men of Ephraim heard Gideon's answer, their anger subdued. So remember just how carefully Gideon handled this. I think there could have been a potential for a quick inner squabble for honor and prestige here, and who did most of the work, or who did the most honorable thing. I mean, at that point, Ephraim and his men had done a great thing in capturing two of the major commanders, and rather than arguing, Gideon just quickly honored them for that, and that brought about a peaceful surrounding, and they could, in that setting, continue their warfare with the enemy. The rest of chapter 8 has to do with Gideon completely subduing, down to the point that he had two of the, I'm not sure what they were called, their names were Zepah and Zalmunna, and I picture it like they were chased down to the last whit, and he caught them. And I won't read the account; it's too gross for me to read it. What I want to continue reading though is chapter 8, verse 22. This is an interesting thing that I think is worth pointing out. It says, "Then the Israelites said to Gideon, 'Be our ruler. You and your son and your grandsons will be our rulers, for you have rescued us from Midian.' But Gideon replied, 'I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you. However, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from the plunder you collected from your fallen enemies.'" The enemies being the Ishmaelites, who wore gold earrings. "Gladly," they replied. They spread out a cloak, and they each threw in gold earrings they had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, not including the royal ornaments and pendants and purple clothes worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of their camels. Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites went whoring after them and worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. Anyhow, the Gideon story ends with Gideon going home. Did you know Gideon had 70-some sons? 70 sons, that's a lot. He had 70 sons born to him, for he had many wives. He also had a concubine in Shechem who gave birth to a son whom he named Amalek. And then if you keep reading through Judges, Amalek would have been the next one to rule over Israel. And he was good and bad. He was up and down. He got ridiculed for being the son of, you're the son of the concubine, and so on, and not the real offspring of Gideon, and so on. Gideon died when he was very old. He was buried in the grave of his father Joash at Ophrah in the land of the clan of the Abiezer. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping the image of Baal, making Baal their god. They forgot the Lord their God, who had rescued them from all their enemies surrounding them. Nor did they show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, Gideon, despite all the good he had done for Israel. Anyhow, so that's the Gideon story. I think it's just quite a few points there that are really outstanding. Some of them I made already, just how important it was for him to tear down the thing that was the problem, that they were invaded, and that was their false gods in their midst. Tear that down, and then pursue God's will in subduing the nations, which is, I think, ultimately what Israel was called to do. But I'm telling you, like, if they had these false gods in their own midst, there was no victory to have. The reason for why the number of warriors was lessened was just that it would be foolproof that God and His power is what it takes to subdue the enemy. And just in how Gideon handled the inner conflict, I think was an outstanding thing for me. And just, esteeming the others better than himself, and saying, yeah, you've accomplished a lot, way more than I have. And then just his weakness of, or maybe others have different thoughts about that, but I think it was his weakness that he didn't call on the Lord. There's no records of him calling on the Lord before he put together this ephod and set it up in his own hometown. It ended up being, like it says, a weakness for Gideon and his family. And so I'll leave it at that. You can add your own thoughts and comments and corrections.
Yeah, I just want to say that I appreciate the reading there of Gideon. Over the years, I've drawn a great deal of inspiration from the story of Gideon. It went for some years that I think it dawned on me one time, like, I think I know why I relate to the story of Gideon so well. I think Gideon had some of the same struggles that I do. At least I think I see it in, like, Gideon seems to me to be a man that second guessed a lot, kind of doubted himself, like he heard something like that seemed to be from God, but then seemed to second guess himself, like, oh, but how can I be sure this is from God? Let me lay out a fleece. And then even after the first time should have been obvious, like, I'm not sure though. Let me try it one more time. or just, you kind of see that. I think I see that characteristic in Gideon. That's something I struggle with, is like having thoughts and inspirations and things, and then having a little bit of a hard time discerning whether did I just come up with that thought, or was that from the Lord, or those kind of things. But there's just lots in there. I appreciate that soft answer he had that turned away the wrath of the men of Ephraim, I think it was. I also like that little phrase when he was seems like maybe that pursuit after the initial attack there with the torches and the trumpets and the Midianites, started turning on each other and then fled, and they pursued after them, and then there's this little phrase in chapter 8, verse 5. It seems like maybe this pursuit lasted a couple days, possibly. And it says there, when they came to that one river, it says, he and the 300 men with him crossed over, and they were weary, yet pursuing. And I've just read that. When I read that sometimes, I think like, oh yeah, it's not a sin, or it's not wrong to become weary, but it's a failure if we stop pursuing. And so anyway, those are some of the thoughts I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Atlee. When you were reading at this time, for some reason the beginning and the ending kind of jumped out at me. In the beginning it sounded like the Midianites and the Amalekites were taking all the food that the people had, and like the setting is that Gideon was found in the wine press hiding his wheat threshing from the Midianites. And so I think presumably like what was happening is there was famine, like the people had to flee to the country, to the mountains, in order to hide what food they had. And I don't know, that sounds almost like a fairy tale or real far removed, but just a couple weeks ago I was reading some history about Russia, and in 1920 the people were starving to death in Russia, and thousands of them died. It's well documented, and there was civil war in the land, and the Red Army was appropriating all the food that the people had. And I think like the St. Petersburg population dropped by like 50% because the people were running away and just the peasant people were just trying to survive and be able to feed themselves without giving it all to the Red Army. And so it's a really desperate situation, that Gideon was facing in the face of all that. And then as soon as he died, it says that the people turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. And even before that, like they were esteeming this ephod. It's just amazing how predictable people can be. Like when we're desperate, we're all interested in turning to God, and when our needs are met, we're just real quick to turn to other pleasures. Anyway, that was a thought I had. Thank you for reading that.
I don't know if Brother Atlee or any other brother had this in mind. Maybe Brother Duane did. Why would not the Lord allow all the people that were with Gideon to go and afterwards celebrate the victory? But the Lord said, just this small number, lest the people say, our own hand delivered us. Now when you were talking about that, a thought came to my limited understanding. I think it was the Apostle Paul that said, I labored more than many, but not I, but the grace of God that works in me wonderfully. So I think that would be the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ. Whenever we do something good, yes, it's good to be thankful for that. Thankful to the Lord that He is able and willing to use the useless, to help the helpless, to seek the lost, to lift up the fallen. He's doing everything. Now thinking about that, what if at the end of the day I got down on my knees and I remember that was wrong, this was not right, deficient, misunderstanding. All the deficiencies, everything that is insufficient, everything that is weak, that's mine. And that's what I should ask the Lord to forgive me. I believe, brothers and sisters, that on the day of judgment, there will not be one single soul that will tell to the Lord, I wanted to be saved, but thou hast not chosen me. There is no such a thing. On the other hand, there won't be anyone that will say in truth, I did everything good, and now look, I have no reward. The Lord Jesus Christ is our great shield and our great reward. And all the praise, honor, and glory to the Father goes through the Son. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Brother Atlee, for mentioning Gideon, and of course, what's the Indian proverb? Walk a mile in someone's moccasins before you criticize them. So how does it? Something like that, right? Don't walk a mile unless you walk in their moccasins or you walk in shoes before you criticize them. And like Brother Dwayne, my comments would kind of match his more. That, and I appreciate Max and Dijon's comment also, that Gideon's mentioned in Hebrews 11 with Barak and Samson. Barak says, hey, I'll go, Deborah, if you go with me. Wavering faith, wavering. I'm on fulcrum. I can go either way in the seesaw. And Samson, of course, and Gideon. And what about God told the Israelites, just take the land, and the Israelites went to Moses and let us send spies out before. They had to, and only Joshua and Caleb, of course, did it. But the wavering faith, the word paragon means, I guess, model. And I don't hold him up as the high faith. And I did it. I went 5 times. Well, don't be upset with me like that. He is not, to me, he's my example. I walk a mile in his shoes with the moccasins, and he's in there with Samson and, what's his name? Jephthah, but Barak. But I'm going to mention the models. I think that I have a Gideon's Bible here, and when you were reading out, they just said, how did they use the Gideon's Bible and the name? 2 businessmen met in Wisconsin 100 years ago, and they started this thing, and they basically to honor Gideon and his 300 men. Yeah, that's the 300 men. Jonathan said, let's take the garrison. It's armor bearer. Are you with me? The armor bearer said, yeah. It's in Maccabees. The armor bearer gets a lot of credit. The 300 men should get a lot of credit. And Jesus talks about, well, not Jesus, but in Hebrew writer, the Gentiles. That's us, okay? That's us. Rahab, Roman centurion, Cornelius, the Canaanite woman and the Samaritan leper. These are the Gentiles that had more faith than the Jews, although Caleb and Joshua definitely would be the paragons of faith. So let's strive to be not only like Gideon and Samson and Barak, but let's be the Canaanite woman. Go ahead. What did Jesus say? I haven't seen such faith in Israel as this Gentile and that Gentile and this Gentile. And we're Gentiles, but I haven't walked that mile in the shoes. But thanks, Atlee, for the lesson. But I still like some of the Gentiles over Gideon. The Lord be magnified.
Amen.